Scope and survival are two terms that are used in programming, and they refer to variables primarily. The variables are the dim statements that you have inside of a sub-procedure. Now, in this case, for example, we have two variables, my tax and my income, and they're declared inside of this sub-procedure called calc income tax. Because they're declared inside of this sub-procedure, their values at the start of this sub-procedure are 0. And as the sub-procedure progresses, their values will change, and they will change from 0. But as soon as the sub-procedure is finished, they will reset back to 0. So the values assigned to these two variables only survive while the sub-procedure is running. So the term survival means that as soon as the sub-procedure is finished, they reset back to nothing. And when we're talking about scope, these two variables are only known to this sub-procedure. Any other sub-procedures do not know about a variable called my tax and a variable called my income, because they are declared within the sub-procedure. They only survive within the sub-procedure, and their scope, they're known only within the sub-procedure. So let me show you what I mean by this. Let's close this chapter 8 file, so file close, and I'm going to open up a new file. File new, and create. And I'm going to save it as chapter 9 and make it a macro enabled workbook. Save. In the Visual Basic Editor, I'm going to insert a module, and then back in the code file I'm going to take a copy of a sub-procedure called calc profit. And paste that into my Visual Basic Editor. Okay, so this particular sub-procedure has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables declared inside of the sub-procedure and 3 constants. Basically, what we've got here is we're going to calculate the gross profit based on my sales and my expenses. So let's add a statement. My sales equals input box into the sales. My expenses equals input box into the expenses. Alright, so they'll enter a sales, which is my sales, they'll enter an expenses, it'll calculate a gross profit, and these will be variable every time, and then depending on the gross profit, it will be taxed at these various constant rates, either 30 cents in the dollar, 33 cents in the dollar, or 4 cents in the dollar. And the net profit will be basically my gross profit minus the tax. So let's have a look at this. So if I was to press F8, first of all, let's just rest on my tax. At the moment, all the variables are 0, 0, 0, 0, and 0. But as we progress through the sub-procedure, so I'll press F8 and enter a sales figure, say 100,000. Now the variable has a value of 100,000, my sales. If I press F8 on my expenses and I say, okay, 25,000, now the variable my expenses has a value of 25,000. They started out at 0 and now they've got values as I've entered them. Now as I calculate my gross profit, F8, that now has a value also outside of 0. And then depending on the values, the tax will be calculated. So my tax at this point is now 24,660. Net profit, I presume at this stage is 0, but as soon as I press F8, it will acquire a value. And then a wee message comes up. The new value for net profit is 50,000 roughly, and the tax is 24,000 roughly. So I go OK. Now as soon as I go F8, if I went F8 again, they've all gone back to 0. So the values assigned to these variables only survive while this procedure is running because they're declared inside of this procedure. So that's scope and that's survival. Now let's just reset. Let's move these variables and constants out of this procedure and into what they call the general declarations area. So I'm just going to press enter a couple of times to push calc profit down. I'm then going to select this information here, and I'm going to cut it out of its sub-procedure and put it up here. Now up here is known as the general declarations area. So I paste it into the general declarations area. Okay, so the idea now is that we actually change the dim statements because they sit outside of the sub-procedure. In fact, I might just leave them as dim for the moment. If I now click in the sub-procedure and press F8, and I enter a sales figure of 100,000, same as before, and enter. My expenses is 0, but as soon as I go F8 and enter, say 25,000 again, my sales is 100, my expenses is 25. When I press F8, my gross profit is 75,000. And so it goes through and does the exact same thing it did before, calculating the net profit and bringing out basically 50,000 and 24,000, same as before. Now if I go OK and go F8 and then go F8 again, if I now rest on my sales, it actually remembers the 100,000 I had before. It hasn't gone back to 0, and yet I haven't inputted it yet. And my expenses hasn't gone back to 0. It's stayed at 25,000. Gross profit has stayed at 75,000. Net profit is still at 50,000. And my tax is 24,000. So the point being, by declaring these variables outside of the sub-procedure and in the general declarations area, they haven't reset back to 0. So their survival is now beyond being inside the sub-procedure. And also their scope is, they are known by the sub-procedure even though they sit outside. So other sub-procedures would be able to use these variables because they'd be seen by all the sub-procedures because they're not declared within a sub-procedure. So they call that scope and survival. I'll just reset. By putting it in the general declarations area, all the sub-procedures in this module will know about these constants and these variables. But if I had another module, and I might do that, insert module, module 2 would not know about these variables and these constants unless I made them public. And made the constants public as well. Now that these variables and these constants have been publicly declared, all sub-procedures, not just in that module but across all modules, will know who these variables and who these constants are. Their scope will be seen throughout the entire project, and their survival will be maintained. They won't reset back to 0. They will just continue to accumulate. So let's do another example. I might take this message box out of here, go into module 2, create a sub-procedure called message, and put them in there. So the idea now is if I was to press F8 and to run the sub-procedure, I get 0. That's fine. And F8 to stop that. But if I go back to module 1 and I go back to calc profit and I press F8 and start running this, so I'll put sales in of 100,000. I'll put expenses in of 25,000. It works out the gross profit. It works out the tax. Ended. Then if I go to module 2 and I go F8, there are my values. This sub-procedure is completely separate and in a separate module, and yet it knows who net profit and who tax is, because their scope is beyond the sub-procedure and beyond module 1, because they have been publicly declared in the general declarations area.